Welcome back to Fictional History 101. I'm your fictional professor, Aaron Johnson. We're continuing our classes on JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, focusing on the Battle Tendency arc today. In our last class, we covered the events of Jonathan Joestar's life, as well as the rise and fall of his rival Dio. One thing that we didn't go into too deeply was the stone mask that brought about so much of the tragedy in his family's life. Today, we'll be going back and seeing the origin of this stone mask, as well as the Joestar descendants that would come to face the stone mask in its ancient origins. To do this, though, we have to go back much further than the 1800s, to a time before recorded history. Going this far back, there was another race of humans. These humans could not survive in the sunlight, as when exposed to UV light, they would quickly turn to stone. Thus, they lived underground. While they fed on living things, they would only emerge during the night to do so. They lived long lives and rarely reproduced. They possessed superior bodies and intellects, and while other humans regarded them as gods or demons, they lived in relative peace. While there's no official name for this race of humans, we'll refer to them as pillar men for brevity. They followed a particular rule that the stronger their race became, the slimmer their population. They hoped to live in balance with the earth through this method. To say that pillarmen were superior to the average human is a gross understatement. They were able to shift their bodies in inhuman ways, able to compress and stretch their bodies as well as contort themselves unnaturally. They boasted greater senses and typically genius levels of intelligence. The gulf between them and the rest of humanity was far greater than the gulf between humans and their ancestors. From this group of humans came an especially ambitious and brilliant man, Kars. He hoped that his people would one day be able to walk in the sun and take all of the earth for themselves. To this end, he created the stone masks, one of which would be found hundreds of years later by the Zeppeli family. Kars planned to use these masks to give himself more power as he continued to grow in strength as he consumed other living beings. The other members of his race feared his growing power. While Kars tried to share his ambition for ruling the earth with them, they feared the power he promised would consume all life on the earth. Together with his friend AC/DC, the two killed the other members of his race, save for two babies, Santana and Wamu. With his race nearly extinct, save for his selected few, Kars turned his focus to perfecting his stone mask. They found that the stone mask could puncture human brains, turning them into vampires. But the effect was not easily reproduced on the pillarmen. They would need a powerful energy source to give the masks the strength to pierce their superior bodies. Around 3000 BCE, the pillarmen began to test the stone mask on humans. They used thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of humans as test subjects for the mask. They found that they would need the red stone of Aya. The red stone was a flawless jewel that could absorb and refract light at 1,000,000 times the intensity, as well as amplify Haman energy channeled through it. This was the key to perfecting Kars' mask, and was held by the only people that could threaten him, Haman users. Just as Haman was dangerous to vampires, it was also dangerous to the pillarmen, and could injure or even kill them if used properly. The stone was held by a group that existed roughly around 0 CE. While Kars and the other pillarmen would wipe out most of these Haman users, they would not be able to reclaim the stone, last tracking it to a Roman emperor that existed around this time. Unable to find the stone, the pillarmen would turn themselves to stone. Santana in Mexico, with Kars, AC/DC, and Wamu resting in Rome, they planned to wait until a later time to begin searching for the stone again, hoping that it would resurface while they slept. The red stone would pass through the remaining Haman users, each protecting it and readying themselves to face the remaining subjects of the stone mask experiments. From here, we cut ahead to 1889. After Jonathan Joestar's death at sea, Irena Joestar arrived in America. She was pregnant at the time with Jonathan's son, and had rescued a young girl from the sinking ship. Unable to care for her pregnancy, as well as the orphan child, Irina entrusted the orphan Elizabeth to Strizo. While Elizabeth was raised by Strizo, Irina gave birth to her son, George Joestar. He would grow up to be much like his father, with an adventurous and noble spirit, and join the RAF, the Royal Air Force. During this time, Speedwagon had made a fortune investing in oil. In 1911, he established the Speedwagon Foundation. While this foundation was outwardly meant to further science, medicine, archaeology, and other fields of science and technology, its true purpose was researching the effects of the stone mask and developing resources to combat it. Elizabeth and George Joestar's paths would cross later in life, and the two would fall in love, marrying sometime around 1920. Not long after, Elizabeth would give birth to her son, Joseph Joestar. George served as a member of the RAF during the First World War. Unfortunately for him, one of his commanding officers was one of Dio's remaining vampires. While George had a natural talent for Haman, when he confronted his commanding officer, he found himself outmatched and was killed by the vampire. This death would be covered up and explained as a nighttime plane crash. While Strizo and Speedwagon were suspicious of the circumstances of George's death, Elizabeth immediately understood the cause. She went to the vampire's office, slaying him with her mastery of Haman. Unfortunately for her, a soldier found her standing over the burnt body of the vampire and sounded an alarm. She would be chased from the building and declared a murderer and traitor to Britain. Speedwagon knew the real details of the situation and used the Speedwagon Foundation's resources to help Elizabeth leave England and establish a new identity. Irina took in Joseph, asking Speedwagon to tell the young man that his parents had died. Irina had hoped that Joseph could be protected from the grim reaches of the stone mask and its users. Elizabeth adopted a new name, Lisa, and parted with Joseph, hoping to protect him just as Irina did. While Lisa would go on training in Haman, hoping to continue fighting the stone mask and its creations, there was another Haman user who would be born around this time. Caesar Antonio Zappelli, son of Mario Zappelli and, more importantly, grandson of Baron William Zappelli, was born in 1918. While his father would leave him and his family only 10 years after Caesar was born, it was not due to negligence, as Caesar would come to believe. Rather, Mario Zappelli was following in his father's footsteps and preparing for the time when the Pillarmen would awaken. While Caesar's early childhood would not be easy, with relatives stealing what money had been left to the family and Caesar entering a life of crime, he would discover that he had a natural talent for Haman. By 1934, Caesar would encounter his father again in Rome. While following him, Caesar would come face to face with the resting Pillarmen. Lured to them by a jewel set into the stone with them, Caesar was nearly killed by a trap laid by the Pillarmen. Instead, his father Mario pushed Caesar out of the way. As Mario Zappelli was slowly absorbed into the pillar, he told Caesar to seek out Lisa and begin studying under her. Caesar would follow his father's dying request and begin training his Haman. Joseph wouldn't be offered this opportunity. Instead, he grew up with his grandmother Irina and discovered his ability to use Haman on his own. While he wouldn't have the same mastery that Caesar was training to have, in 1933, when he was only 13, he was able to use this ability in order to fend off plane hijackers that attempted to kidnap Speedwagon and himself. Sometime during the previous 40 years, Strizo had succeeded Master Tonpetty, becoming the new Haman master. While he was still able to slow his aging through the use of Haman, just as Tonpetty and Zappelli had done, he still felt himself growing older over the years. He began to fear growing old and enfeebled, and looked for other means of prolonging his life. In 1938, Speedwagon led an archaeology team to Mexico. This team uncovered the Aztec ruins that had housed Santana, as well as a number of stone masks. When they investigated Santana's stone form, they were able to detect a faint pulse and other signs of life. Speedwagon called Strizo to Mexico, hoping to use his Haman to eliminate this threat to humanity. Unfortunately, Speedwagon didn't realize Strizo's true agenda, to take one of the masks for himself and live forever. Strizo killed the other Haman users with him, as well as Speedwagon's staff. He gravely injured Speedwagon as well before taking one of the masks and turning himself into a vampire. While Strizo headed to America, planning to kill the young Joseph Joestar in order to ensure no one could threaten him, another group came to Mexico looking for the ruins Speedwagon had uncovered. In 1939, the German army deployed SS Major Rudolf von Stroheim to lead a research team to investigate the sleeping Santana. The research team found Speedwagon and began interrogating him, as well as performing experiments on the sleeping Santana and the stone masks. This was all in order to grant their soldiers an advantage on the battlefield, as well as to prepare themselves for the time when the Pillarmen in Rome would awaken. They would subject many of the locals to barbaric experiments, including forcing people to use the stone masks. While Strizo would arrive in America and nearly kill Joseph, he found that the inexperienced Haman user had other tricks at his disposal. Fending off Strizo with a machine gun, hand grenades, and even carefully used shot glasses, Joseph was able to defeat Strizo. Wishing to die feeling youthful and powerful, Strizo generated his own Haman, causing his body to break apart. As he began to die, Strizo told Joseph about the Pillarman sleeping in Mexico and urged him to deal with this threat to humanity. Joseph headed to Mexico to look for the Pillarmen. Once there, he found the German base and disguised himself as a soldier to sneak inside. Once in the base, he was able to find Speedwagon, as well as Stroheim, who was preparing to awaken the sleeping Santana. When the Germans awakened Santana, at first they believed him to be an imbecile. He could hardly stand on his own, and seemed to have little understanding of the world around him. When they released a vampire they had created into the room with Santana, the Pillarmen quickly absorbed him. Rather than simply draining his blood, he pulled the vampire into him and completely absorbed his body. Almost immediately after, Santana escaped to the confinement room by squeezing himself into the ventilation ducts. He would quickly emerge into the room Stroheim and the others were in, killing many of the soldiers and researchers before attacking Stroheim and Speedwagon. However, Joseph was able to protect them using his Haman, and was even able to gravely injure Santana. However, even with Santana's legs removed, he was still able to fight back against Joseph. Realizing the only way to defeat this awakened Pillarman was to drag him into the sun, Joseph started pulling the man outside. However, Santana continued fighting Joseph. With Joseph struggling to reach the door, Stroheim ran ahead to open it, letting the sunlight into the room. While he was able to reach the door, Santana grabbed hold of the German soldier's leg and began to absorb him as well. In order to prevent Stroheim from being absorbed, Joseph cut off the man's leg. Now free of Santana, Stroheim was able to open the door. Faced with the sunlight, Santana would compress his body again, forcing himself into Stroheim's body through his severed leg. Knowing that he couldn't remove Santana without killing himself, Stroheim told Joseph to go to Rome, where the Pillarmen are sleeping. He warned him that they would awaken soon, and Joseph would need to meet with someone Speedwagon knows to refine his Haman technique. Stroheim would then use a hand grenade to blow apart his body, exposing Santana to the sunlight again. Finally weakened enough through his repeated injuries, Joseph was able to subdue Santana for good, turning the Pillarman's body to stone in the sunlight. With Santana defeated, Joseph headed to Rome, while the Speedwagon Foundation would recover Santana's remains for further experimentation. They found even with exposure to the sun, Santana was not dead, but merely dormant once again. His remains would be kept under continual UV lights. While Stroheim would be presumed dead, his body would be recovered by the German army, and his life saved through the use of revolutionary prosthetics. Joseph and Speedwagon went to Rome, meeting with the young Caesar Zappelli. Speedwagon hoped that Joseph could train with Caesar in order to improve his Haman technique. However, Caesar harbored a grudge against Joseph, believing that Joseph's grandfather Jonathan was responsible for Baron Zappelli's death. While the two fought, they would eventually head to meet with the German team that had uncovered the other 3 pillarmen. While Joseph and Caesar were on their way to the dig site, Wamu awoke and killed the Germans guarding the sleeping pillarmen. He disabled the UV lights they had placed in the room to keep them dormant, and awakened Cars and AC/DC. Caesar, Joseph, and Speedwagon arrived not long after the 3 pillarmen had awakened. Caesar and Joseph fought with Wamu, though both were badly injured by the pillarmen and hardly able to damage him in return. Trying to defeat Wamu with similar tricks that he had used against Strizo, Joseph lured Wamu away and onto a minecart, hoping to kill him with a bundle of dynamite. Wamu saw through this ruse as well, and prepared to finish off Joseph. However, Joseph still had more tricks at his disposal. Joseph pretended to surrender. He played on Wamu's pride and sense of honor, and told him that if he had been given a month, he would become strong enough to defeat Wamu. Intrigued by this, Wamu accepted this challenge and placed a poison-filled ring around Joseph's aorta, while AC/DC did the same with a ring around Joseph's windpipe. The rings would dissolve in just 33 days, releasing the poison and killing Joseph, unless he could reclaim the antidote from Wamu and AC/DC. While the pillarmen had spared Speedwagon, Caesar, and Joseph, the Haman users had no means to fight back against them. They would need to improve their techniques, as well as acquire new allies if they hoped to fight the awakened pillarmen and stop them from becoming unstoppable through the use of the stone mask. As there's still a lot to cover, we'll call it here for today. While Dio and the other vampires created by the stone masks were powerful, the pillarmen were a clear mark above even their level of power. Able to easily defeat both Caesar and Joseph alone, each pillarman was a dangerous opponent. We'll go into the next half of Battle Tendency in our next class, where we'll focus on the growth of Caesar and Joseph as Haman users, the battle for the Red Stone, and the ultimate fate of the pillarmen. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at fictionalhistory101@gmail.com, or send a tweet to fickhist101. We'll still have a bit to cover next class, so make sure you finish Battle Tendency before then. Thanks again for joining us in class, and please, don't forget to study. The intro and outro music for this class is Labyrinth by Enrico Altavia, courtesy of freesoundtrackmusic.com.